For our second panel, we have a real treat. Secretary John King was appointed in 2016 by President Obama to be our country's 10th U.S. Secretary of Education. He also served as the first African American and Puerto Rican Education Commissioner for New York. John currently serves as President and CEO of the Education Trust, a national nonprofit that seeks to identify and close opportunity and achievement gaps for America's students. John is an education trailblazer at heart. Throughout his career, he has demonstrated that he believes that the system should work for each student and that it is critical for our country to address the inequities in access and opportunity that exist for so many students. John began his career as a high school social studies teacher and later founded Roxbury Prep Charter School in Boston. He developed the curriculum and the rules and the culture. And under him, Roxbury students attained the highest state exam scores of any middle school in Massachusetts. They closed the racial achievement gap, and they outperformed students from Boston's affluent and mostly white suburbs. As a policymaker and leader, John is someone we all need to pay attention to. We've asked John to reflect on his experiences and work in education and share his insight on how we can fix long-standing issues of inequality and improve and support students in our respective states. I've spent more time on Zoom with John this year than in person prior to the pandemic. He has dedicated his career to putting students first, and I'm excited to hear his recommendations for strengthening education. Let's welcome Secretary John King.
Hey there, Secretary King. It's such an honor to be with you and to be able to have this conversation. I'm so looking forward to hearing what's on your mind, and especially as we've been navigating COVID-19 and the biggest disruption in U.S. education that we've ever seen. And so really looking forward to getting your insights. What an incredible leader and pioneer that you are. You carry the mantle for so many firsts out in the world. You broke ground in 2011 when you became the first Black and Puerto Rican leader to serve as New York State Commissioner. And of course, then you went on to serve as U.S. Secretary of Education in 2016 and 2017. Your leadership has always been an inspiration to me, and I know many others. And so where I'd like to start is with your personal journey. I'd love for you to share more about yourself. Tell us what sparked your interest in education and a bit about your path to becoming Secretary of Education, if you will.
Sure. Well, first, I'm excited to be in this conversation with you, Elisa, and so appreciate your leadership on behalf of teachers all over the country and the work you're doing to build our next generation of teachers. So thank you for your leadership. I come to the work of education really driven by my own experiences growing up. I grew up in New York City. Both my parents were New York City public school educators their whole lives. My father was African-American, grew up just after the turn of the 20th century in a very segregated New York City, but saw a path to opportunity through education. My mom was actually born in Ponce, Puerto Rico, came to New York as a kid, learned English in the New York City public schools, and wanted to support other kids, became a teacher and then a school counselor. And they both spent their whole lives working for the New York City schools, but they couldn't have known the difference that New York City schools would make in my life. When I was a kid, my mom passed away when I was 8, October of my 4th grade year. And I lived with my dad. My dad was sick with undiagnosed Alzheimer's. And so during that period, home was really hard. I didn't know what my father would be like from one night to the next. Sometimes he was sad. Sometimes he was angry. I didn't know why he was acting the way he was. So home was this really scary and unstable place. But the thing that saved me was school. School was the place where I felt safe, where I felt nurtured and supported and engaged. And I was very fortunate to have a series of New York City public school teachers who gave me a sense of hope and possibility. And my dad passed away when I was 12, and I moved around different schools, different family members, but it was always teachers who encouraged me and gave me a reason to be optimistic. But then when I was in high school, like many kids who've experienced trauma at an early age, I got in a lot of trouble. So much trouble I got kicked out of high school. I would say I'm the first U.S. Secretary of Education to have been kicked out of high school. But, again, it was teachers who were willing to give me a second chance, and the school counselor, and willing to see me as more than the sum of my mistakes. And so that role that educators played in my life really drove my decision to become an educator. I just love being able to try to do for other kids what teachers had done for me. And so I taught high school social studies and became a middle school principal because I wanted to try to, impact the lives of more students. And got into education policy because I wanted to think about how we tackle these huge equity gaps that we face as a country. And as you and I have talked about many times, our future as a country depends on closing those equity gaps, ensuring that race and income don't define students' educational opportunities. And so I had the privilege of serving in leadership roles in New York and in the federal government, and now lead the Education Trust, which is an education civil rights organization. So really my whole career has been defined by trying to give all kids the kind of shot that schools gave me, the chance to make of their lives what they will.
I've heard your story before many times, but it's always so inspiring. And, I often say kids can't beat what they can't see. And so hopefully you just know the power of your presence and all that you've done. So thank you for the gift of sharing a bit about yourself so vulnerably with all of us. So you touched on this, Secretary, where we're looking and experiencing all of these equity gaps, which have existed way before COVID. But somehow the curtain has been, opened, and folks are very clearly seeing the massive inequities in our system. And there's this conversation about how we're at risk of these equity gaps becoming even wider. And we know that our kids have so many needs, basic needs that need to be met right now, from just security, safety, food security, just lots of trauma our children are working through as they see loss all around them, as they deal with the economic repercussions of the moment, and as, family members lose jobs, et cetera. We know we need a trauma-informed approach to the effort right now. And a very human one is all I keep saying, gosh, we just need to be human in this moment. And we're also very present to what the potential learning loss is here and what the research is telling us. We look at the NWEA study that's saying kids are in grave danger of being just a whole generation left behind. And we know that impacts not only our kids' lives and their ability to contribute to our society, to our economy, the strength of our community as a whole. So can you talk to us a little bit about your view on the impact of, COVID, the shutdown, what all this means for education, and what should our federal and state leaders be doing about this right now? What's your advice and your thinking around this?
Yeah. Well, just as you framed, COVID-19 has been an equity disaster on every level. The health impact of COVID has fallen disproportionately on communities of color and low-income communities.
Yeah.
Black and Latino folks are nearly 3 times as likely to get COVID, twice as likely to die from COVID when they do get it. The economic impact of COVID has, again, been disproportionately experienced by low-income communities and communities of color. Folks of color are disproportionately represented in areas of our economy that have been hardest hit by COVID. And then the educational impact has been quite dire. And as you said, there's the consequences for kids of food insecurity, the consequences for kids of their family members being sick or losing a job. But our educational system, all the inequities that, as you said, existed before COVID, have been exacerbated. So we had a digital divide before COVID. We would call it the homework gap, and we would lament that not all kids had access to the tools they needed to do their homework. But when we switched over throughout the country to virtual school, online learning, We then confront the reality that pre-COVID, about 79% of white families had reliable internet access, 66% of Black families, 61% of Latino families. And as you know, as TFA core members are experiencing in their school districts, we have kids who have not been connected with school since March because they don't have the internet. And this is a problem in high needs urban communities. It's a problem in high needs suburban communities. It's a problem in high needs rural communities. So that's a huge challenge. There's a device gap challenge. We still have kids who are doing their homework, their schoolwork on their mom's cell phone, sharing maybe their mom's cell phone with a sibling, right? Because they don't have device access. Yep. Low resource districts really struggled with professional development and support for their teachers in the transition to online learning. Huge socio-emotional impact for kids who are now isolated. You know, I shared about my own journey. I can't imagine what life would have been like if I had to go months without those relationships at school with teachers and peers that made such a difference. Mm-hmm. So I worry a lot about kids who are in homes where there's addiction or abuse or economic trauma, health trauma. And then, you know, as you said, NWA studies points to the likely learning loss. McKinsey did a study that suggested 7 months on average of learning loss, 9 months for Latino students, 10 months for African-American students. So we really are at risk of losing a generation of students. But the path forward is actually quite clear, right? We need a national effort to make sure that every kid has a device, every family has the internet. That is doable, that is achievable. We know how much it costs, down to the dollar, how much it would cost to provide a Chromebook for every low-income student, for example. And yet we haven't done those things. We haven't had the political will to do them. We must. We have to tackle the learning loss. The United Kingdom is going to mobilize a national tutoring corps. We should do something like that, make a huge investment in mobilizing particularly recent college graduates who are graduating into a tough economy, mobilizing them to be tutors, trained, but to then support our younger students around their learning. We should be putting in place plans for an extended school day and school year as soon as we can get back into buildings. We should be providing at the federal level stimulus dollars to help districts avoid cuts and pay for things like personal protective equipment and ventilation improvements. And it's great news that a vaccine is on the way, but we've still got months left in this school year and we can't afford to lose them. So there's work that we need to do, both to get back to school, address learning loss, and then we need more counselors and more mental health services. I mean, we need to address the socio-emotional toll this period has taken. And then if you step back, and certainly I'm sure this is something that everyone in this audience is thinking about, we've got to ask, how will we build a future that is more just and more equitable than what existed pre-COVID? It is not good enough to just go back to how things were in February of 2020, because in February of 2020, low-income students and students of color were getting less of all the things we know matter, from quality early childhood to well-prepared teachers to advanced coursework to access to school counselors. So we need to kind of address the impact of COVID, and then we've got to ask, how do we build a better future for our kids?
I often say there's a lot of things we want normal again, but what we don't want is the normal before COVID when it comes to the system that was serving our kids.
That's right.
Serving many and leaving many behind. So it's an opportunity in that way to rethink how can we do this that, you know, centers equity ensures we're meeting all of our kids' needs. So one question on this, you know, you very comprehensively talked to us about what's needed. And one of the things I know on my mind and many people's mind is when we think about addressing learning loss and interventions, and how to allocate scant resources, you know, how do we think about assessments and accountability, right? So this spring, for the first time since 2003, the federal assessments and school accountability were suspended for obvious reasons in response to COVID. And this summer, even before schools reopened, whether it was virtually or however, we had some states asking for waivers on assessment and accountability. It's a dicey question that lots of folks are talking about. So curious, if you were New York State's commissioner right now, how would you be thinking about assessments for the coming spring, and how do you encourage others to sort of get their arms around this question?
Yeah. We have to start with the values, right? What are the values that should drive how we think about this? One value is it's important for parents and teachers to know how kids are doing. We've done polling at the Ed Trust of parents all across the country, and in state after state, what we see is parents saying, I wish I knew more about how my child is doing, and parents saying, overwhelming percentages of parents saying, they're worried about whether their child is on track academically, whether they're losing ground because of COVID. So one value is we got to get information to folks. The second value is we need to surge resources towards the places of greatest need. And to be able to make those decisions about resource allocation, we have to know where the challenges are. We can't solve a problem we can't see. So we have to have information about how students are doing in order to allocate the supports, whether it's tutoring or summer school or other interventions. Another value is that we have a long history as a country of systematically underserving low-income students, students of color, English learners, and having disaggregated data has been a crucial tool for civil rights advocacy and organizing. So with those values in mind, then we ask, well, what will the spring look like? One, we don't know, right? We don't know how quickly the vaccine distribution will happen. We don't know how well we as a country can respond to the public health guidance to try to get infection rates under control. So we don't know. Will we be back in school by the spring? Will we be hybrid or virtual? And likely it will vary across our 13,000 school districts. So what I hope states are thinking about now is, how do we deliver the assessment either in school or at home so that we have information about how kids are doing? Now, we have to adapt our accountability approach because this has been a very strange, not just school year, but 2 school years. And so we can't use the information in quite the same way as we have in the past, but we need the information, and we can't kind of put our heads in the sand and wish away the academic challenges that have come with this COVID period. So we need the information. States could be investing in developing the technical capacity that the assessments could be administered at home. We know that is possible. States may want to think about adapting the assessment to make it easier to administer, both at home and in school in these complicated circumstances. So for example, California, where Linda Darling-Hammond is the state board chair, they are committing to shorten the Smarter Balanced assessment so that they can still make sure it's delivered in the spring, but not have to manage in quite the same way as they have in the past. So states should be thinking creatively about how they get information again to families and teachers that they need. And
so, John, just to push one layer deeper on this, and you alluded to this, a lot of the conversation that I'm hearing, and the reason I said it's dicey is because a lot of educators who are, they're heroes in this moment are having to play 3D chess as they manage all of the change and needing to respond to everyone's needs, centering with students. Folks are there. I hear a lot of the either or conversation, like you can't possibly, be able to meet the needs and then hold this, assessment and accountability. It seems unfair or, and I'm empathetic to where folks are coming from, but perhaps the answer is how this accountability has been used has to be reconsidered in the moment. But how do you help people think through that and not have it be this binary, like it's an unfair thing to do given what we know is happening all around us right now? That our kids are managing that learning is just so difficult, and virtual learning, as we know, is incredibly difficult to do well, especially for lower grades. Talk us through a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I think we have to acknowledge that we have not, as a country, done a consistently good job of providing the supports that the data tell us we need, right? So we can't just use the assessments to identify problems so that we can admire the problems. We have to take action. And I think part of what you hear from educators is this fear that the assessments are going to be used in a way that is about blame or shame, as opposed to as a tool for providing the necessary supports. So if in a school we identify that many kids are off track in terms of reading skills, that's really scary. If you don't become a strong reader in the early grades, you can't access science and social studies and math and so forth, because you need to be able to read to do those things. So it's really scary if reading skills are not strong in the early grades. So then what do we do? And I think there's a fear of educators that what we'll do is we'll just label school or school community as failing and not follow through with, okay, well, here's the professional development for teachers around the science of reading. Here's the team of reading specialists who will be deployed to help address students' needs. Here's the additional tutoring capacity, after school capacity, summer capacity to help students get what they need. Here's the wraparound services to try to address the issues of food insecurity or inadequate access to housing and healthcare that are getting in the way for kids. And I think if we were able to show that we were going to ensure that the resources follow the identified need, I think that would help build confidence. And one of the challenges we have in this political moment is you have this paralysis that we haven't been able to get a new stimulus bill from Congress. States and districts are worried about big cuts.
Right.
So we've got to kind of shift the conversation by saying, yes, there are going to be resources here to provide kids with the support they need.
That it really resonates. And I was literally going to go to that resource question next, because this is a big thing, right? The state revenues and the impact of that, given the pandemic and the economic downturn. And the fact that, we've invested 5 times less right now through this crisis than we did in the last recession. So how should state leaders be thinking about this, and those reductions? What should we be doing to ensure that we're able to meet the moment? I mean, you just laid out very clearly all of the needs. And in fact, we need more investment than we did even, in the last recession, than given our moment of truth. What's on your mind about that?
Well, look, I think, we need Congress and the executive branch to act on a stimulus that includes funds to stabilize state budgets, funds for school districts to get the PPE and ventilation improvements that they need to be able to open safely when the rates of infection are down in a community. And that includes money to address learning loss and socio-emotional needs like counselors and mental health services. Congress and the federal government need to deliver on that. The federal government can borrow, state governments cannot. So it's really incumbent on the federal government to act. So there's an advocacy posture our whole sector has to have to say, Congress must act. That said, there are real equity questions around how states use the resources they do have. So I think about Ohio as a positive example. Ohio realized they had to make cuts because it just didn't have the resources. So they made the cuts in a way that was intended to protect the highest needs districts. They cut the state aid at a higher percentage in affluent districts than in high needs districts. And for a district like Cleveland that serves large numbers of low-income students, that was teachers and counselors and services for students that were saved by Ohio making cuts in a way that sought to maintain a degree of equity. And so my hope is that Congress will require of states that if they have to make cuts, that they are protecting the highest needs districts. But all of us could point our advocacy as well to state governments to say, look, whatever resources we have to make sure that those resources are weighted towards the communities that have the greatest need. And the reality is affluent school districts can go back to their taxpayers and ask for more at the local level, whereas our high needs districts, they really can't. And so their hands are tied, and we can't risk those school districts, facing the consequences of 10, 15% cuts. I mean, that just would be brutal for kids and families.
Devastating. Mm-hmm. And can you share a bit about the sort of public will or coalition needed, as you observe what happened in Ohio, that gets folks to be able to choose the whole community that ensures everyone will rise, especially in this moment of crisis. Any insights on that front?
The coalition that often advances equity in education is a coalition of civil rights groups, parents and educators, and then the business community, because often the business community can see the long-term economic consequences of underserving their future workforce. Right? There's a economic imperative around ensuring equitable education opportunity. So we need to build that coalition. We need that coalition to be heard loudly. And we need to go to legislators, both with an argument for more resources and an argument for how we will make sure that those resources are well used. And, sometimes in our politics, there are folks who want to spend more, but they don't want to talk about any constraints on how the dollars are used. And then there are folks who want to talk about constraints, but they don't want to spend more. I actually think we need a path that draws on both of those things. As Margaret Spellings, who was my predecessor as secretary in the Bush administration, Margaret will say, resources plus reform equals results. I think that's right. So when kids are struggling around reading, do we need more resources? Yes. But do we also need to make sure that teachers are using the science of reading and what we know makes a difference for kids acquiring reading skills? Yes. And it turns out we can do both if we're thoughtful about it.
That's right. Amen to all of that. That's perfect. Well, believe it or not, we are running out of time. So I want to ask one last question of you. And I want to focus on the question of hope. As we know, it's been quite the year of 2020. Mm-hmm. And these days, it seems like people focus on the darkness for very fair reasons. And there is a need for the light. And, where are the cracks that give us that light? And I often think about Brian Stevenson, who's a hero to many, founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, who often says the enemy of justice is hopelessness. So please share with us, how do you stay hopeful? What any examples or thoughts on your mind that sort of keep you centered on justice and the need to both hold, the clarity of where we are and the challenges ahead of us, but also with a vision of hope and possibility?
Yeah. Well, look, this has been an incredibly challenging year for everyone on every level, particularly for schools, educators, families. And yet there are also these places that are doing interesting, exciting things. I think about some of the school districts like Baltimore City, Guilford, North Carolina,
yes.
Or charter management organizations like Uncommon Schools that are creatively deploying staff to make blended learning work well. So they're thinking about, well, who's the teacher on the 7th grade team who does the phenomenal mini lesson on this topic? And how do we have that teacher do that mini lesson for all the 7th graders and then deploy the time of the other teachers on the 7th grade team to provide intensive tutoring and support? That kind of creativity around deployment of staff is really interesting. I think about Northern Virginia Community College that this past summer said, we're going to provide free community college classes to any 11th or 12th grader in our region online over the summer. And it's brilliant. I mean, kids had access to a set of opportunities that wouldn't have been possible but for the technology and the commitment of Northern Virginia Community College to open up that opportunity. When we move forward from this moment, we should never again say, oh, well, you can't take AP Spanish because it's not offered here. Well, what we've learned is that we can, through technology, make courses available much more broadly. And so that should allow us to close some of those access gaps. We've also seen just incredible work to create community for kids, from the Zoom choir performances to folks figuring out how to do outdoor, socially distanced events, to folks producing theater productions where they cut between the different scenes of kids as they're performing. Kids are learning about video editing and all kinds of skills that they might not have developed before this period. So there are reasons to be hopeful in what kids are experiencing. The other thing that keeps me hopeful is just think about the arc of our trajectory as a country. You and I have talked about that in the last couple of years. I've had the opportunity to dig into my family history. My great-grandfather was enslaved about 25 miles from where I live in Montgomery County. And the property is still owned by the family that are direct line descendants of of the people who owned my great-grandfather and his family. And I've gotten to know them. I've gotten to visit the property. And it's as though we're still 1860 in the property. The house maintained in the same way. The cabin where my great-grandfather was enslaved with his family still standing on the property, about 30 yards from the house. And the two things I'm struck by when I visited the property and spent time with the family there. One, the incredible intimacy of the institution of slavery. As I said, the cabin is only about 30 yards from the house. There were these two families living side by side, but one was owned by the other family. And that there's a profound horror in that. And at the same time, the other thing I'm struck by is that in 3 generations, my family went from being enslaved on that property to me having the opportunity to serve in the cabinet of the first African-American president. This country has never lived up to the words of the Declaration of Independence, but we can. It is possible. We are in this process of becoming, and our history is one of progress towards fulfillment of those values in fits and starts. But ultimately, I am quite hopeful because I am here because my ancestors lived into a future they could not see. They lived for the hope of a future they could not see. And so my moral obligation is to continue that, right? To try through my life, through my work, to try to build a future that is even better for my kids, for my grandkids, for my great-grandkids.
What a beautiful ending and such a perfect way to wrap us up in hope. I've read the book Hope in the Dark a few times, and there's this idea that we should be hopeful because the hope comes in the past, and just exactly what you described, like what the future has led you and the opportunities that you have, and that we shouldn't be so arrogant to know what the future has in store for us, that in fact we get to shape that. We get to decide what the future is, and that it takes courage of conviction and often deep leadership and to make a different decision and create a different possibility. So thank you for your incredible insights and inspiration and all that you are doing to help lead us in this moment. And so really appreciate your time and look forward to being in touch again soon. So thanks for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for the conversation.